I feel like saying, hello, Seattle. I should probably say, this is actually the wrapping up of my book tour. Seattle often ends up being the last stop on my book tours. So you're seeing the end of me, or at least the end of the book tour. There are a few more things at home, but this is the stuff, the last on the road. Thank you so much, Town Hall. Thank you, Edward, and thank to all of you for making the time to come this evening. It's always great to come to Seattle. I never feel like I see enough of it. I see plenty between the airport and the hotel, but I feel like at some point I have to make time to come back, just to come back and enjoy all the great things here. So tonight I'll talk a little bit, and then I'll read a little bit, then talk and read, and then we'll be happy to take your questions, comments, and lively discussion mode. So this book, Claire of the Sea Light, started when initially I wanted to write a novel about the radio, because radio is a very big medium in Haiti. I grew up listening to the radio as a means of entertainment, of information, of just everything, because I said that to someone once who was interviewing me, and they said, no TV, and I said, well, electricity, so radio was definitely much more accessible, much more so than TV. So I started thinking I was going to write this book as a radio show in which each chapter was an episode of that show. And the show would be called Dis-moi, Tell Me, and it would be hosted by this woman named Louise George. And all of that is still in the book. Louise George is still there, the show is still there. But the book became about a little girl named Claire, whose father, who is a poor fisherman, is thinking of giving her away to this richer woman named Madame Gaëlle, and also about all these different people in this town, including Louise George. And people often ask, Edward said that it was a novel, and people often ask me, well, is it a novel? Is it a short story? And I think of it as something of a hybrid, something in between. And I think there's so many precedents for that, but I believe every book has a kind of godparent, and the godfather of this book is, I guess, Jean Toomer's Cain. And if there was a co-godparent, it would be the Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, a type of book like that where you visit different people in the town. So Claire's, and the entire book takes place in one single night, and with recollections back and forth, but it's one single night on the beach. And I imagine the reader of this book as someone who kind of, you, the reader, who wanders onto the beach that night in Ville-Rose, which is a small town, in the fictional town, but based on a town that where my mother was born and grew up. So I imagine the reader as someone who wanders on the beach that night, and that morning the book begins with the death of a fisherman to a rogue wave, and they're having a kind of wake on the beach, and a lot of the characters are on the beach. So I imagine the reader wandering on the beach that night and listening to snippets of these stories and trying to construct a feeling of this town. Because for me, I like to be like a participatory reader. I like to be this kind of reader that the writer has left something for me to do. And so this book is like that. It really, it makes you work a little bit. And I think sometimes people think, you're being lazy, you're being cute, you're being confusing with the structure of a book like that. But my intention was that it was just to really involve the reader and make you like a visitor to this town, like I'm a visitor to Seattle tonight. So let's go on a journey to Ville-Rose. I'm going to read 2 short sections, and then I'll take your questions. I also wanted to bring to your attention Ethan Casey, who writes about Haiti. I think he's local. He will be here on November 8th here at Town Hall for his new book, American Road Trip. He told me to tell you guys that. So the first section I will read involves one of the town's sons, Max Jr. Now, Max Jr.'s father is Max Sr., and Max Sr. is the schoolmaster in the town. He has one of the only private schools, the only private school in Ville Rose, and his son, who had raped and impregnated the woman who works in their house. They have a child who's 10 years old. So Max Sr. had sent his son away to Miami to avoid dealing with that. And so 10 years later, he comes back to Ville Rose, and he too is on the beach that night, and he is pondering his life, his son, his relationship with nature, and what he will do next. So the sea is a very important character in this book too, because I think you're an island, you're surrounded by the sea, but also for Haitians, we have the history of coming where we are by sea, through the Middle Passage, but also a more recent history of people leaving Haiti quite often by boat and being lost at sea while they're trying to get to Miami or to Barbados or these other places. So in a story in Creek Crack, where this town, Ville Rose, was first introduced, there's a story in that book called Children of the Sea, where a character imagines a kind of reunion between these people we lost to the Middle Passage and these people who are leaving to go to Miami, and so that we're still losing to the sea. So stories also play a big role, and so this section starts with a story that Max's father used to tell him when he was a boy. Now, as he walked fully clothed to the water, Max Jr. thought of his father's version of a Cornish folk tale, one the old man had told him when he was a little boy. In the story, a boy is lured into the woods by music. The deeper the boy walks into the woods, the denser the woods become and the more beautiful the music. The boy follows this music until he gets so lost that he no longer knows where he is. He becomes so scared that he wants to return home, but he also wants to follow the music to see where it might lead. After he walks so far that the woods become impassable, the boy begins to cry for help, and that's when a quiet spirit emerges and makes a path for him. The path leads to the sea, where suddenly the music stops, and the boy is now so tired that he lies down and falls asleep. When he wakes up, the boy finds himself back home, safely in his own bed, with his head full of music and mermaids and crystal palaces under the sea. The spirit in the woods saved this boy, Max's father said, because the spirit wanted the boy to remain innocent and good, and that innocence and that goodness was as precious as the dreams that the spirit had placed in his head. And because of that innocence and because of that goodness, that spirit would watch over this boy forever. Max Jr. now slipped into the water, feeling the cool waves rise and fall around him as the water ballooned his red shirt. In the sea, he thought of music, the rap-filled kind he had once played on his radio show. He also thought of flowers and birds. He thought of the birdhouses he and his father had built together when he was a boy. He thought of the somber plumage of seagulls. He thought of the pigeons, both alive and dead, and his father's stories. He thought of the orchids and roses in his father's garden, the dragonflies that buzzed around after a heavy rain, and the fireflies that bombarded them at night. He thought of yellow jasmine, his mother's favorite flowers. She would tie a bouquet on the bell of the front of her bicycle. Then he and his mother would ride next to each other through town. They would ride to the Clairin factory, and his mother, sniffing the air, would become giddy from the raw liquor smell. He thought of his mother's history lesson about the ruins of the town. He remembered the talk they had had in the middle of the ruins shortly before she left town. "You are who you love," she had told him. "You try to mend what you have torn, but remember that love is like kerosene. The more you have, the more you burn." He liked his mother's aphorisms. He also liked how she tried to explain the rogue waves. The goddess La Sirène, she said, made her presence known by swelling a wave several feet whenever she craved human company. One night 10 years ago, after he learned that Flore was pregnant, he was sitting alone on a gallery of the old lighthouse when he thought he saw a supernova exploding above the sea. He had wondered then whether he was in shock or overtired or hallucinating, but now he believed that he had neither dreamed nor imagined all of this, that it had actually happened. He was remembering this, he knew, as a way of avoiding thinking about his son, the son he had just met earlier, with an old-faced drawing in his hand. He imagined the old-faced drawing melting, coming apart even now in his pants pocket while he was in the sea. A drawing made by his son who he had just met, his son who he might never see again. Would meeting him today have meant anything at all to his son? How long would it take the boy to forget him? Would his son grow up calling another man father? And if he did, would there ever be some hesitation, a hint of doubt in the back of the boy's mind, something that would ring false in the sound of the boy's voice? The worst possible case of unrequited love, his father had told him, was feeling rejected by a parent. Was the second worse being rejected by your child? He knew quite a bit about unrequited love. Until he had met his son, he'd felt as if every other love were a phantom version, a shadow of the one he would now never have. People like to say of the sea that la mer pa kembe kras, the sea does not hide dirt, it does not keep secrets. The sea was both hostile and docile, the ultimate trickster. It was as large as it was small, as long as you could claim a portion of it for yourself. You could scatter both ashes and flowers in it. You could take as much as you wanted from it, but it too could take from you. You could make love in it, and you could surrender to it. And oddly enough, surrendering at sea felt somewhat like surrendering on land, taking a deep breath and simply letting go. You could just as easily lie down in the sea as you might in the woods and simply fall asleep. So the second section I'll read is about Madame Gaëlle, who's another very important person in the book, because she is the woman who the father has chosen, Claire's father has chosen that he wants to be with Claire. And so on that night, like you, the reader, Madame Gaëlle is also on the beach. And this has been a year, many years of a kind of a seduction, because Claire's father from birth has been trying to get Madame Gaëlle interested in Claire. So Claire, that night, Madame Gaëlle decides, she makes up her mind that she will take Claire, and then Claire disappears. And the book sort of circles around that until we find out how it turns out. But Madame Gaël makes her decision about Claire, but also about many things in her life. For example, that she's not going to leave this town in which she has suffered so much. She lost her daughter in a motor accident. She lost her husband to a gang shooting. But she decides that this is where she wants to stay because, as she says, she likes her ghost nearby. But she's also heard a lot about what happens when people leave, and she doesn't want that fate for herself. And then the structure of the book, too, has a lot. I mentioned Jean Toomer's Cane, and one of the things when I was reading that book and I was thinking of writing my book in the way that it is written, I kept thinking in that book, in Jean Toomer's Cane, there's a lot of poems that to me seemed like songs in the book, and I'd always wanted to use in a story, especially if I was talking about little girls, because a very primary game for little girls in Haiti is something called a won, and the won is like ring around the rosy, and it was something I liked to play a lot when I was a little girl, and there were different songs in it, and I'd always thought that there was something very captivating about it. So there is sort of the structure of the won, but also actual wons in the book. And so Madame Gaël just walks onto the beach that night and sees Claire, and we find out why she decides to finally take Claire, and I have given her my fascination with the won. You can actually bequest qualities of yourself to characters, which is kind of cool. When Madame Gaël finally made it to the beach that night, she spotted a group of little girls. They were holding one another's hands and moving clockwise in a circle, a singing circle, a won. Madame Gaël was too far away to hear what the little girls were singing, but she could hear their laughter. Each girl, it seemed, trying to outdo the next. They seemed to be the happiest people on the beach, 6 little brown and black angels skipping around falling sea hearts and sand dollars. Madame Gaël moved slowly, not wanting the pleasure of her approach to end. She had played the won as a child during recess and at night in her parents' yard with visiting friends. What she remembered most about it, though, was how less lonely she felt holding someone else's hand. It would have sounded odd if she told someone how much she wanted to take all those little girls home, set them up in the many empty rooms of her large house, and whenever she was sad, asked them to play the won with her. There were many days when she wanted to grab a little girl, any little girl off the street, and hold her in her arms, just inhale her smell, the smell that the men she slept with lacked. Their smells were musty. They smelled of roads and dust and cologne that never quite covered their musk. They smelled of work, of sweat, of other women. But little girls smelled of roses and wet leaves and talcum powder and the dew. In spite of what everyone had told her after her daughter had died, longings like this had never subsided, and her losses had not made her stronger. They had made her weak. They had given others control and power over her. She didn't want to continue being weak, but she didn't want to die either. She was too eager to see what would come next, what her husband and daughter had missed in this life. She was both hungry for life and terrified of it. Her evenings with the men she slept with let the rage and confusion disappear for a while and allowed her to make it through the days. They allowed her to sell thread and cloth and remain close to the graves of the people she really loved. There were times, though, that she wanted to leave Ville-Rose, leave the country, and never come back. But she had heard too much about the difficulties of starting a life in a new country. She'd heard about people who had been infantilized while learning a new language. People who ended up cleaning houses, wiping the butts of other people's children. She saw these people return to Villeurose at Christmas or in the summertime with extravagant hairstyles and expensive-looking clothes, but their eyes always betrayed them. All the humiliation they had endured could be detected there. Their skins betrayed them too, the burns from the dry cleaner's steamer or the car wash or restaurant kitchens, as visible as brands on animals. No, none of that was for her. Her ancestors on both sides were buried at the town cemetery among the town's oldest families. She could not be Diaspora. She liked her ghost nearby. She could never live in a foreign land, then return only a few times a year. She could never risk dying and being buried in a cold place. She would always be here, she thought, like the boulder that stopped her feet when at last she reached the little girls. One of the girls, Claire, realized that she was being watched and occasionally glanced her way. Like her mother, Claire was beautiful. She moved more gracefully than the rest of the girls, even the ones who were older. Madame Gaëlle walked over to the girls, and immediately her presence stopped their game. "Is your papa here?" Madame Gaëlle asked Claire. The girl nodded. She was looking down at her hands, then at her sand-coated feet. Claire's eyes seemed to light up the way children's eyes do when they were hungry for stories. "I knew your mother," Madame Gaëlle told her. "I knew her longer than you have been alive. Your mother was my friend." The girl's head was arched towards her, her mouth wide open, as though to inhale Gaëlle's words, which came out so fast that Gaëlle could barely stop. Madame Gaëlle was not sure what she was thinking and what she was saying out loud now, but she kept speaking and speaking. "When your mother was pregnant with you," she said, "she had all the time to do nothing but go out on the water with your father and sew. She waited so long to have you, your mother. I wouldn't even say wait. She tried to pull you out of the sky, pry you out of God's hands. Yes, God's hands, I'd say. I don't go to church every Sunday. I don't go to church at all. But your mother wanted you so bad. I know she pulled you out of God's hands. That's the only way I can put it. She was well the whole time you were inside her body. Never even seemed tired when she came into my shop, except the last week when she didn't come. Then the midwife was sent for. No one knows what happened while you were being born. I hear the midwife thought all was going well. You shouldn't blame yourself. You shouldn't blame yourself. She's gone, back in God's hands, and no one can pull you back. Not you, Claire. I hope you understand. Your mother is now back in God's hands. Your mother and my husband and my daughter and everyone else who has died and everyone else who didn't deserve to die. The who deserves to die. Too many people die here. And why do the rest of us get to live? Happy birthday, Claire, Madame Gaëlle said, both her thoughts and her voice now slowing down. There was still so much she wanted to tell the little girl, though. She wanted to tell her about seeing her mother at her husband's gravesite service, but this part might be impossible for the girl to grasp. Claire's mother might have even been at the cathedral for her husband's funeral mass. The whole town, it seemed, was there, but Gaëlle hadn't noticed if she was. But she remembered well seeing Claire's mother at the burial ground, standing near the cemetery gate. In the normal course of a life as a new mother, Gaëlle, according to custom, shouldn't have been outside in the open air at all, for fear that her nourrice body, weakened by childbirth, might be too frail. but against everybody's advice, the morning of her husband's funeral mass and burial service, she had left her infant daughter at home with the housekeeper and attended both. During the graveside prayers, her breast ached and swelled, wetting the front of her white dress. She looked beyond the deep hole in the ground, beyond the bronze coffin, beyond the priest and a large crowd of townspeople around her, towards the cemetery gate, eager to be at home with her baby. This was when she saw Claire Narcisse, Claire's mother, standing alone under a flame-colored weeping willow by the cemetery gate. Claire's mother was wearing the same plain black dress she wore to the funerals of all the townspeople. That morning, it seemed that Claire's mother and the weeping willow had become one. Claire's body seemed indistinguishable from the small part of the willow's trunk that was not covered by its drooping branches. The mother's head was topped by the willow's golden crown. She had seemed that morning to be a dazzling mirage, a veil between the dirt being piled on her husband's coffin and the wailing baby waiting at home. And Claire's mother's presence at the cemetery gate and the surprising way it had both jolted and comforted her was one of the reasons she had agreed to take Claire. And now she could honestly to the girl, tell her that the mother was her friend. Thank you. I think now for your questions, if you have some. I know the greeners, I thought at first Edward was talking about farmers when he said the greeners, until he mentioned the name of your school. So the greeners, welcome greeners. I hear you're reading Create Dangerously. No pressure on the greeners for questions, though.
And if you do have a question, please do come to one of these two microphones, and I'm sure we would love to hear from you, so be brave.
Okay, someone there.
Come up to the microphone.
I guess I can repeat for her if she's. If she can, I'll repeat for you. Okay. Well, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. It was a beautiful comment that it would be so immodest to repeat. But she said she doesn't read much fiction, but she liked Claire. Thank you so very much. That meant a lot. That reminds me, there was a Haitian comedian who, he's Pastor Blasé. He is this thing. So he does these skits where some missionaries come, and someone has to interpret. So sort of this bad interpreter. So the missionaries will say, I'm going to give you guys 1,000 bags of rice and rebuild your church and $1 million. And the interpreter says, he says hi. Go ahead.
I have a question, like as a writer, do you have any advice for aspiring writers or anything like that?
Advice for aspiring writers, I would say, first of all, I think most writers are readers. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Sometimes people are saying, I need a mentor to be a writer. And, there's so, you have mentors from Tolstoy to Junot Diaz down, it's like they're all in the library. So I would say read, and then just practice writing. And are you in college or?
I'm with the Evergreen State
Oh,
College.
okay,
so-
you're a greener. And then participate like in sort of literary things, and just write. You can write for if your college has a literary magazine, and to try to participate in that. I did that when I was in college, and but the important thing is to just practice, get in the practice of it, and make a little time that's just for that. And if you feel like, if there's a class, if there's a writing class, to take it, because sometimes writing class also will guide you towards, some writing teachers will guide you towards a kind of reading that coincides, that might help with the kind of writing that you're doing. But it's important to read and practice. It's one of those things that you have to practice different genres, and then when you feel ready, you can enter contests or submit to literary journals. But it's important to concentrate on just bettering your craft and fine-tuning it, and that's by reading and by actually writing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name's Sarah Ann, and I'm also a greener. My class is actually studying the interrelationship between people and place, and I always have an interest in plants as a marker of place. Could you tell us a little more about your selection of the weeping willow?
Well, yeah, I am probably as far from a gardener or a plant person as you could go, but I'm extraordinarily fascinated by nature. The weeping willow I chose because I often see them in some cemeteries in Haiti, and sometimes that it's like other nature that just is very colorful and bursts. Like just driving from the airport here, you get a sense of all these, the foliage turning. There's something so I think extraordinary, miraculous about that. And just even in a tropical landscape where the foliage or the fauna and all that takes such different, the flora takes such different just colors and hues, and so I chose the weeping willow because I had seen weeping willows in cemeteries, and it seemed like the kind of tree that if someone like this character Claire's mother was trying to hide, it seems like the kind of tree that she would seek in which to hide, and I had that image so clearly in my mind that if I were a painter, I would paint it of just like her, like the top of the tree being almost like her hair. And then this book, I sort of use nature more than I have in any other book, because a lot of the characters are outside or work in nature and sort of where they live. But that's a choice of that tree that I kept wishing I could paint, because I would have loved to have painted that, because also for me it would have brought me closer to sort of an image of what this character, of a full physical image of the character, who still resides in my mind and in this book with words.
Positively beautiful, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm not a greener, but I love your work. It's absolutely beautiful, and I really appreciate it and appreciate reading it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your writing process and how it changes between writing fiction and writing the sort of memoir narrative nonfiction that you write.
Thank you so much. I mean, when I got to this book, I was very happy to go back to fiction, because with fiction you have total free reign. It's if there's something, you can bridge gaps, you can make things up. I just felt so, after doing 2 books of nonfiction, I felt so free. I felt like there's a part of me that was just unchained. Even though I loved doing those books, and they were special to me for different reasons, but I just loved re-immersing myself in a world of my own making. So I think in terms of choice also, whether you write something as fiction or nonfiction, because there are things that you could go both ways for me. I feel like with nonfiction, when I was writing the memoir and the essays, for example, all of that already exists, right? The challenge is how you tell it and how you structure it. And it actually helped to have written fiction going into nonfiction, because before writing the memoir, my thought about it was that, okay, if it happened, you put it in, right? It's like, and then I realized, because I had done fiction too, like you still have to tell a story, you still have to worry about pacing, you still have to make these types of, editing choices, like, you have to cut things out that may have happened, but because they're not relevant to the thrust of the story, which I wouldn't have thought before about nonfiction. So really, in a way, and also I think my fiction is very much informed by sort of the rigorous research you have to do to write nonfiction, because sort of the more research you do, the more sort of a veneer of authenticity you can render onto the fiction. So really, the process of having, now I find that they inform one another. The fiction informs the nonfiction in terms of, like, really, I'm still telling a story. You still have to engage people, and you can't take for granted just the fact that it happened, that they're, and then on the other side, this sort of really creating a world and doing research and actually making it seem real, which was very helpful in this book too, because also creating a fictional town and writing it as though you were reporting on it, really like you were there visiting it.
Thanks so much for being here tonight. I guess my question is about Haiti, and I grew up in Montreal, where there's a fairly large Haitian community, and so it was always a country that I was very aware of growing up. And then here in the U.S., obviously in the last few years since the earthquake, it's a country that's been very much in the news, and often unfortunately for sad reasons. And I guess I'm curious whether you view your writing in part as a way to draw attention to Haiti and to let people know about it, and what you view as the role of writing in general, and particularly of fiction, in serving a political cause in terms of bringing attention to the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think probably for those reasons that you've mentioned, for the political reasons, the socioeconomic reasons, so all of that, Haiti has always had a very strong homegrown literature, a very powerful one, and it's one that was so, I think, so powerful that it was a threat often to the dictatorships that especially the Duvaliers. A lot of the writers were exiled, and some of them were killed. So there's always been that very powerful literature that does both sort of that some that just talks about, like, beautiful women and beautiful flowers, and then others that were super political, that had a kind of a purpose. So there's been always that range in the literature. So I think as part of what I feel like I'm doing, not just is to, in my work and in some of the work that I work with in anthologies, other writers, trying to get translations out in the world of our writers, is to try to offer a complex, sort of a wider range, like this range of the writing that I take for granted, is to offer that to the larger community. Because I think often places like Haiti, people think they already know it, because, yeah, I've seen it on CNN and they already know it. But if you read a novelist like Marie-Vieux Chauvet, who's one of our great novelists, Stéphane Alexis, Jacques Roumet, all these, if you read their work, you're like, wow, and a lot of the work, has, it's like a lot of writers in other parts of the world, but also that addresses this specific reality. And so it adds layers to what people think about. And I think that's often the role of, you asked about the role of art and the role of the artist. I think greater than the role of the artist is the role of art in general. And that sometimes you read a book and you understand the people in the book better than you understand the people in your own life. And if that goes across culture, I think that even goes deeper because it sort of forces you to question your own prejudices, your own stereotypical notions about Haiti, and Haiti is always presented in sort of this one-toned way. And so I always think of our writers as ambassadors to counter that, as the musicians, the paintings, the visual art, can tell a different story, can offer another type of narrative. And that's why I've also worked on editing. I edited 2 volumes of this Haiti Noir series, which is kind of like, I feel like it's personal marronage, like under the guise of noir. I got to share all these wonderful Haitian writers with others. And so in January, we have Haiti Noir 2 coming out, and these are older writers like Marie-Vieux Chauvet, these writers that I mentioned who are classic writers. So I think the role of the writer is chosen by the writer, and it sometimes is directed by the circumstances, because you might have a writer who's very apolitical, but who's called at a certain moment to step forward and has to make a choice in certain ways. So the writer ultimately chooses that role, but ultimately it's an engagement first to the people in the stories that this writer is telling, who are due nuance and complexity and a kind of not stick figure-ish and one-dimensionality.
Oh, wow, this is really great. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you for coming.
I'm with the other Evergreen class that's here. We're reading Creating Dangerously. And in the first chapter of that book, there was a bit where you talked about a writer's origin as the nationality of his or her reader. And I was wondering first, what inspired you to choose that method of thinking for this book? Because I think it worked well. But,
Okay.
And also, with that in mind, who do you write for?
Okay. Well, in this collection of essays, Create Dangerously, in the first chapter, I try, first of all, I had decided to write that book as a way to find out how people come to their art. So then we talk about these, painters and photographers. One of them is a friend of mine, Daniel Moel, who decided he was going to be a photographer when he was, as a young man, brought to witness an execution, which I talk about in the first chapter of the book. But that notion that you mentioned, I'm citing in that situation a friend of mine who is also a phenomenal Haitian writer, Dany Laferrière, who is from Canada in Haiti. So he moved from Haiti to Canada. He lives in Canada, but he moved from Haiti to Canada when he was a young man. And his most famous book is Comment faire l'amour avec un nègre sans se fatiguer. How to make love to a Negro without getting tired. And is actually the title of the book. And I once asked him how. He says, "You let him do all the work." That was his answer. But so the Danny came up with this notion that you mentioned because he said, Danny said he was tired of people asking him, "Are you a Haitian writer? Are you a Canadian writer? Are you a Caribbean writer? What kind of writer are you?" So he came up with this notion, and I cite him in this essay that so he said people would say, "Are you a Haitian writer?" And he would say, "I am a Japanese writer." and they would say, "How's that?" He would say, "Well, the writer belongs to the nation of his reader. When I'm read by a Japanese reader, I become a Japanese writer." And to back that up, he says, well, when I was a boy in Tigouave, which is a small southern town in Haiti, he said that when I was reading Goethe, I was reading Flaubert, I was reading Sophocles, they became Haitian writers. Otherwise, what were they doing in my room? That was his thinking. So that whole, it's a notion that I so appreciated that I talk about it in the book, but it belongs entirely to Dany Laferrière, author of How to Make Love to a Negro Without Getting Tired.
I'm certainly not a greener. I am I'm a Barnard alumni.
You're a silver fox.
Right. But I am a Barnard alumni, and I welcome you to
yeah.
Seattle.
Oh, wow, thank
and my
you.
question is, you were 12 when you moved to the States. How did you find Barnard? And did you find Barnard? You have all these wonderful stories within you that you're waiting to come out. Did Barnard help you in getting these stories out? And I'd like to know.
Oh, well, yes. I'll tell you my whole recruitment story to Barnard. I came when I was 12, and I lived all that time in Brooklyn. I didn't get much to the city, except a couple of times a month when I would go to this paper that I wrote for called New Youth Connection. So the Barnard recruiter came to my college, to my class, and I was like, okay, what's that? And I went on a visit, and my parents were more enamored, I felt to say, initially than I was, because they were like, they're very strict Haitian parents. They were like, women's college, yes. And so I applied, and then I loved it. I loved it because they were very small classes, or they're high school students who were recruiting for Barnard. There were, the small classes, and I took my first writing classes at Barnard, fiction writing classes, and I was extraordinarily shy. And I would enter the contest to the advice of that young person. I would enter all the contests there, and I would win them, and I was very shocked. So I got a lot of encouragement at Barnard, and I think it's, everything they say about women's colleges, especially for people like me who were just so shy, you really get a little time to develop your voice. So it was a very important. And then my first job after school, I got through I worked in financial aid, and I basically I worked from 9 to 5 in financial aid at Barnard. After I graduated, I stayed at Barnard, and I would work from 9 to 5, and from 5 to 9, I wrote most of the stories in Creek Crack in the financial aid office at Barnard College. So, so it made a very big difference. Yes.
Hello, thanks for speaking.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. I was really struck by this part in your book. Do you mind if I read it to you?
Oh, go ahead.
And during,
cringe.
and during this final conversation, I'm even more certain that to create dangerously is also to create fearlessly, boldly embracing the public and private terrors that would silence us, then bravely moving forward, even when it feels as though we are chasing or being chased by ghosts. And I guess my question for you is, where do you draw strength as a writer to create dangerously?
I draw strength from the process itself, and sometimes what you're writing requires sort of a strength on the level of civic engagement, but sometimes it also requires just personal bravery. I think and the title "Create Dangerously" from the book comes from a lecture, one of the last lectures that Albert Camus, the French Algerian writer, gave, where he said, to create today is to create dangerously. And that was 1957, when he was saying, what he was being asked to take a position against for independence of Algeria, and he was hesitant, and he got a lot of heat for that. And sometimes that to create dangerously, the courage demands a political statement, but sometimes it just demands oh my God, I don't want to fail, I don't want to look like a fool, I don't want my mother to be mad at me, or I don't, it's all these other things that I think can censor people. So everybody has to call that thing out of themselves, and just to find that courage, and now I think a lot of young writers I meet, their first outing is online, which sometimes can be so brutal with comments and all of that. I think that even requires another level of courage, because you're sort of out there in a new way, and anybody can anonymously blast you. So I think that the courage comes from when you feel like you can't be silent, right? And that even if nobody was reading it, you would still write it. And often people who write, or people who create any kind of art, they feel like you just feel like incomplete if you're not doing it. And I think sometimes that gives you, the courage to counter all those risks, because you feel like I am not fully whole if I'm not doing this, and it's not something you can fully explain. I think a lot of art, a lot of creativity is like that, but if you feel like you just, can you imagine people who were writing on napkins and while they were in prison for things they had written? Now that's a kind of, there's something so overwhelming about that it's beyond you. And so I think that then that courage just is built in there. But everybody has to find that within themselves. And sometimes people are severely tested, like these people who are in prison. But other times it's just as simple as not wanting to fail or not wanting to embarrass yourself. So there's a whole range in that, and what would be called courage there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I know the guy who writes all the Amazon marketing emails pertaining to you, and he says to say hi, but that's
okay. The guy at Knauf?
No, at Amazon.
At Amazon?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I didn't even know there was a guy like that.
Yeah, there is.
Tell him I said hi.
Yeah.
Tell him I said to delete all those 1-star things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But my question is about Diaspora. How do you think, other than the ocean as such a major theme, does Haitian diaspora differ from other diasporas?
Well, I think, it's the Haitian diaspora, it's one of probably the more persecuted ones. Mm-hmm. I'll give you, this very week, we have maybe 2 weeks ago, there's a court in the Dominican Republic that decided that they were going to strip citizenship from anybody who's been there since 1929, unless they have a Dominican parent. But if you're Haitian, or how do you have a Dominican parent if citizenship is stripped from everybody from 1929? That's almost 4 generations. So you suddenly have 250,000 people stateless, basically. So I think I think that follows in different manifestations in different places, and maybe because we migrate in such large numbers to some particular places. So and maybe I'm sort of looking at it from that perspective. So I think there is that. It's a very, in a way, it's, you have in some, on one end, some very people who are excelling, people who are doing well, but then you have also this diaspora that suffers a lot, a lot from sort of stigmas, and even, in the 90s here in the United States, when they were just starting to talk about AIDS, and I remember it was like the first early years when I came, and they were calling it GRID, and Haitians were the only people in the high-risk groups who were identified by nationality. So they said, who are the people with high risk for AIDS? Homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin addicts, and Haitians.
Wow.
So I think it's a diaspora that's on that's sort of on a very hard journey, and I don't know if part of it has to do with the fact that we are, most of us, poor, and because of that poverty, certain things that come with that, and have to migrate more. Now you have people in refugee camps, like in Brazil, who are sort of new migration towards Brazil. So I think in this particular moment, from that perspective, I think that's those things for some reason seem to be attached to us, and sort of a kind of journey of persecution, of not being wanted in different places. So that's actually one thing in terms of the difference that I think about. But that being said, too, I think we share a lot of other things with a lot of other immigrants who's end up in urban centers, who want the same thing for their children, who are trying very hard, who are trying to create a new life. And so for people like my parents who came here and could have ended up in all of those other places too, but ended up here and try to build a life and try to contribute, and so that things are better for the next generation.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think we're going to wrap after everybody who's standing gets to ask. You can, oh, okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
Juno Diaz often writes about people's responses to his use of vernacular, and I am interested in seeing how people have responded to your writing. In terms of, like, he writes in Spanglish a lot, and he's gotten a lot of negative responses to that, saying that it's not accessible to certain audiences, and I'm wondering how people have responded to yours, or what you think about that in general.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe people are more polite to women, I don't know. But they've kind of held their tongue with me. People don't complain as much, but I think also he uses more than I do, but there's something that he contributed to this discourse for me. So I remember when he was getting started, and in all the books, like in everybody's books, it was we all took it for granted that if you had a word in a different language, it would be in italics. And he really would fight, like even with the New Yorker. I think the New Yorker, they still do him in italics, but he would really fight to not be not have like the Spanish sentences or in italics, because he would say, I don't speak italics. And so I started saying to editors, I don't want italics because I don't speak italics. And it worked. So that whole sort of the merging of the other language into this language is as effortlessly as we're able to do it now. I feel grateful to him for.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. You're wonderful.
Thank you for coming.
So in your book, Create Dangerously, you speak of having your feet planted in both worlds, and I wanted to ask you what home means to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, what a beautiful question on which to end as I head home. Home, I feel like, because when I was little, my sense of home was so specific. It was so particular. It was this house in Bel Air where my uncle and aunt was, and were my cousins, who was like me, who had parents working abroad. So for me, that was just home wasn't even a country. It was just a very specific house, right? And then then my parents sent for me, and I moved to Brooklyn. And then I felt like, then after that, home could be anywhere, right? Once I had left that one house, then I realized that home is where your loved ones are. It sounds very corny, right? And I think that's part of that when you inherit migration, like I didn't migrate on my own choice, but even I think people who migrate as older people, you realize once you can leave that place, it's almost like once you've left your mother's womb, then you can be anywhere, right? And so I realized it's become it's like home is where my children are, where my mother is, where my brothers are, where the people I love are. And sometimes some of them are in Haiti, some of them are in Miami, some of them are in New York, some of them are in Montreal. You probably know them. And that's just, home becomes, it's very corny, and corny things are sometimes true. Home is where the heart is, ultimately.
Thank you.
Thank you.